mile-long freight train rolls past a crossing, car after car after car, until finally the last one clears the gate and the gate arms start to lift. Most people look away right about then, already checking their mirrors, already moving. But if you keep watching for one more second, there is something small clamped to the very last coupler, riding along behind the entire train with nothing behind it but empty track. A metal box, no bigger than a toolbox, with a red light pulsing steadily into the distance. Nobody is sitting back there. Nobody has been sitting back there for decades, not since long before most drivers waiting at that crossing were even born. So what exactly is doing the job that used to belong to an entire rail car full of people? Let's get into it right here on Small Things. A plain box under 30 pounds. Railroaders call it an end-of-train device, though almost nobody actually says that out loud. On the job, it goes by a nickname, Fred, short for flashing rear-end device, and the crews who watched it take away their co-workers' jobs were not always feeling generous when they said it. Strip away the nickname, and what's left is a plain, weatherproof box under 30 pounds, clamped onto the rear coupler and connected to the train's brake hose with a single fitting. A red marker light blinks on its housing. Inside sits a battery, a pressure sensor, and a small radio. That is the entire physical inventory. It looks like almost nothing, which is exactly what makes the thing it replaced so hard to believe. Everything a caboose actually had to do. It did not begin with an engineer deciding a caboose was unnecessary. It began with the caboose itself, and everything a caboose actually had to do every single day it rolled. From a raised glass cupola on the roof, a conductor and a flagman watched the entire length of the train ahead of them for shifted loads, dragging equipment, and the most feared problem of all, a hot box, an overheated wheel bearing that could seize and derail a car at speed without any warning from the front of the train. The caboose carried a brake gauge, an emergency valve that could dump air and stop the train from behind if the front end ever lost control of it, and paperwork the conductor filled out on a fold-down desk between stops along the line. It also happened to be where people lived for days at a time on longer runs. A cast-iron stove bolted to the floor, narrow bunks built into the wall, curtains someone had hung in the windows because a train car did not have to look like a train car just because it technically was one. For most of a century, that arrangement simply was the railroad. Then, in the 1960s, a small Florida railroad running between Jacksonville and Miami found itself locked in a brutal, drawn-out fight with its own unions over labor costs, and the company pushed harder than any other railroad in the country to run trains with fewer people on them. In 1969, that same railroad bolted a small electronic box to the rear coupler of a freight car and sent the train out without a caboose behind it. The box did almost nothing by comparison to what it replaced: a battery, a brake line connection, and a light that blinked in the dark. But the railroad had proven something the rest of the industry could not ignore. A car that cost tens of thousands of dollars, weighed 25 tons, and needed a full crew to operate could apparently be answered by something that weighed about as much as a bag of concrete. Within 20 years, the caboose was gone from mainline freight service almost everywhere in the country. What replaced it did not do the job the same way. It had not yet learned how to. What the box could not yet do. So what exactly could that little blinking box do, and just as importantly, what could it not do? The earliest versions, fittingly nicknamed dumb units, only lit up in the dark to mark the end of the train. A second generation added a pressure gauge a crew member could walk back and check by hand if something seemed off. The real leap came with units that carried a radio, sending brake pipe pressure forward to a receiver in the cab every 40 seconds, giving an engineer a constant readout of what was happening at the back of a train more than a mile behind him without a single person back there to report it. But that system only sent information in one direction, and a train's brakes work by releasing pressure through a single connected pipe running the entire length of every car. Picture that pipe as one long garden hose stretched between dozens of cars. Squeeze the nozzle at the front, and the pressure drop should travel all the way to the far end. Now imagine ice forming inside that hose partway along its length. The signal from the front never reaches anything past the blockage. That is exactly what happened on certain mountain routes. A frozen or blocked brake line meant an emergency stop applied only to the cars ahead of the ice, while everything behind kept rolling and shoving the rest of the train forward with nothing to stop it. The result was runaway trains, and the runaways killed people. The fix required the box to do something the earliest versions never could: listen as well as talk. Engineers gave the device a matching radio at the front of the train and a valve at the back, so a single button in the cab could now send a command all the way to the last car, releasing brake pressure from both ends of the train at once, regardless of any blockage in between. What sounds like a small technical adjustment, a device that could finally receive a signal and not only send one, is the detail that made the whole replacement survivable. Not one box, a network. It's tempting to picture the Caboose's replacement as one clever box doing an entire crew's job single-handedly, a simple swap, one piece of hardware standing in for one rail car full of people. That is not quite right. The box handles brakes and confirms the train is still in one piece, but the rest of what a cupola crew used to watch for now belongs to a network spread out along the tracks themselves, not to any single device. Hot bearing detectors scan every passing axle with infrared sensors, checking for the exact kind of overheating that once had to be spotted by eye from a moving cupola. Dragging equipment detectors catch anything hanging low enough to snag on the rail. Acoustic sensors listen for the specific sound a wheel bearing makes just before it fails completely. None of that lives inside the little red box at all. It lives buried beside the rails, mile after mile, doing the watching a person once did from a cupola window. None of this means the trade was painless or obviously one-sided. A person in that cupola really could smell burning grease from a bearing before any sensor triggered, or notice a load that had shifted just slightly, subtleties a machine still struggles with today. The replacement did not happen because the technology was simply better in every way from day one. It happened because, piece by piece, a scattered system of boxes and trackside sensors closed enough of that gap to make the trade-off worth taking. People who barely think about it. At the end of a run in a Chicago rail yard, a conductor climbs down, unbolts the end of train device from the coupler in under a minute, and carries it toward whatever outbound train needs one next, the way he might carry a toolbox from one job site to another. He has done this hundreds of times and thinks about it the way anyone thinks about picking up a tool at the end of a shift. Not at all. In the cab of a train crossing Wyoming at 2 in the morning, an engineer glances at a small readout showing steady brake pressure from a car she has not seen with her own eyes in 6 hours. When the number holds where it should, she does not think about the technology behind it. She just keeps her hand near the throttle and watches the track ahead, trusting a machine she could not explain in detail if you asked her to. Beside a rural crossing at dusk, a retired railroader who spent 30 years riding in a caboose watches a freight train go by out of old habit, waiting the way he always has for the last car to finally clear. When the small red light passes at last, he still nods once, the same small acknowledgement he used to give a friend leaning out of a cupola window on the way past. There is no one back there to see it anymore, and there hasn't been for years. He does it anyway. The light is still blinking. The train from the beginning has long since disappeared past the crossing, its sound fading into the distance the way it always does, traffic already moving again through the gates. But somewhere back there, past where you stopped watching, a small red light is still blinking exactly on schedule, exactly as promised. It is still confirming every 40 seconds that the last car is connected, that the air pressure is holding, that the train is whole from front to back. Nobody is watching from a cupola window anymore. No one is living in that space the way people once did, run after run, year after year. The job that person used to do is still being done, every bit of it, out past the last thing you noticed. It just doesn't need anyone standing there to do it. If this changed the way you look at the next freight train that passes you by, let us know in the comments what you want us to explore next. We might make it our next episode. Thanks for watching. History often hides in the smallest details.